So for our science experiment, for multiple means of engagement, there's a few different steps along the way that will really help make the whole lesson more accessible to every student. Not every student is going to understand what needs to be done for the procedure, for the experiment, in what order. That's a lot to memorize, so it's important that students know all of the steps along the way. So, a really easy way to do this is just hand out the experiments to students. After you do your pre teach for the experiment, you just give them kind of the lesson plan that you're working off of, or if you can make a list if that's easier, or if it would be more student friendly, make a list of all the steps that they need to do so you don't just expect students to memorize. That could be really difficult for students anyway, but especially students with disabilities, this could be a really huge barrier to making sure that the experiment is done correctly. This will save students a lot of time from asking a lot of questions, you having to go over the directions a ton of times, and it makes the lesson more accessible for students because they just have all the instructions. They don't have to retain everything the first time you tell them. Even that, sometimes it's not enough for students. Having that handout is great, but it could be other places in the classroom as well. So, if it's up on the board when you're doing the experiment, if every student has a copy and you go over it, you make sure that all bases are covered. So, put it up on the board, give students a copy of what the expectation is, and go over it in your pre teach initially. Oh, look at that, I magically changed clothes. It's totally not the next day or anything. Anyway, the next thing that you can do to try to make this lesson more accessible for students is letting them work in partners. The lesson originally calls for students to just kind of work on their own, but I personally don't feel that that's vital to the experiment. They're not getting anything more out of working by themselves than they would be working with a partner. So, if that's easier for the students, you might as well let them. It's kind of one of those no harm, no foul sort of situations. So, if that makes it easier for the students, if they are able to work better with another mind working with them, then so be it. So also for the procedure and the assignment or in the experiment, it's important to make sure that you as a teacher are going around to each student or each group, whatever they decide to do, and checking in on them and seeing how they're doing in the process. If you're just kind of letting them go and do their thing, hoping that they understand, you passed out the papers, it's up on the board, whatever, it's still not helpful to just assume that they know what's going on or that they don't need any help. And instead of making them sit there and raise their hand, just be bouncing around. Make yourself available to the students so that they can ask questions whenever it pops up, instead of having to kind of fight for your attention. So at the end of the lesson, as kind of the conclusion or the wrap up before the assessment, there's questions for the students to answer to kind of understand what they're supposed to be taking away from the lesson, and that's really important. It's good that there's sort of a conclusion to the experiment, so it's not just an experiment with seemingly no point. If it ends abruptly, it comes off as a bit odd. So, for this ending part of the whole experiment, there's about 8 different questions listed, and answering them like it's just worksheet style, which we all know is not really the best approach to a lot of things. So, in order to make this section more accessible to everyone, it's kind of just important to let them answer how they best feel fit. If that's just writing out the answers and getting it down on paper, then that's great. But that doesn't work for every student. And similar things to the next part that we're going to be talking about, letting them sort of be more creative with how they choose to answer is great. It'll all become the same learning and they'll accomplish the same task, but it may be a bit easier for them to do. So, letting them answer verbally, I talk about this in the next one as well. Letting them answer verbally, it's just 8 questions. It's not really going to take very long. So, you as the teacher, as other people are doing their assessment, whatever it is they're doing, or if, one group finishes and other people are still working on their experiment, going up to them and just kind of jotting notes about what it is that they're saying so that you can still have that information for later to look back on. You can also let them draw pictures and label it. Really, it shouldn't matter how students get to the answer as long as they get to it. So if that means just writing it down, cool. If they want to tell you it, cool. And if it's good for them to draw it, if they're really artistically inclined, or if that helps them kind of put their thinking on paper, then that's great. And then in order to make it more relevant to the students. So the questions that they have are kind of just rote memorization stuff. I mean, it's all stuff that you're supposed to learn in the experiment, but it's nothing that is very applicable to students in their everyday life. Like, one of the questions is, what are the physical properties of baking soda? You'll learn that, and that's all well and good, but who cares after this experiment is done? So making it more pertinent to them is really important. So just talking to them about what they found that was interesting in the assignment, or what they thought was important that they took out of it, instead of trying to tell them what you think is important. If they can kind of come to that conclusion on their own, I think it'll feel more, it'll feel more meaningful, and it'll make more sense to them. So that's kind of how we decided to structure multiple means of engagement. There's a lot of other things you can do, but like I said in another video that's on our website, it depends a lot on your students, where they're at, and what they need out of the lesson. So these sort of things change all the time. We're working with just kind of a hypothetical situation at the moment. So coming up with some ideas about how you can make this lesson more accessible, but different students are going to need different things. So this isn't the be all end all of how to do good science instruction. Knowing your students, knowing what they need, and knowing what will help them is the best way to go about any of these sort of situations.